I built a solar company from nothing. Then my own daughter stripped my name from the board. No goodbye. Just a cold envelope and a guard at the elevator. That morning, I drove across Arizona without turning on the radio. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was personal. And as the sun burned over the desert, I kept thinking, if they could erase me from the company I created, what else had they already taken without asking? I arrived at the office at 6:25, just like I had for the last 27 years. The same travel mug in hand, the same desert breeze brushing against my shoulders as I walked from the parking lot. The early light hit the glass front doors, catching my reflection as I tapped my badge. Nothing happened. I tried again. Still nothing. Inside, I could see Nora at the front desk. She glanced up, then quickly looked down, pretending to sort something in a drawer. That alone should have told me something wasn't right. A man I didn't recognize stepped out from the elevator bay. Tall, built like a former cop, the kind you don't hire for customer service. He held a white envelope with my name typed on the front. No return address, no company seal. He said my badge had been deactivated for security protocol updates, and this was from the board. I took the envelope, nodded once, and walked back to my car. I didn't open it. Not yet. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, both hands on the steering wheel. I had turned 71 just last week. My daughter Brielle had given a speech at the company dinner, thanking me for my years of dedication, for being a visionary, a trailblazer. There were flowers. There was even cake. I remember her saying, "You'll always be our North Star." I guess stars can burn out quietly. Instead of driving home, I pulled onto the old highway out past Apache Junction. I didn't play music. I didn't make any calls. The desert rolled out in all directions, and the sun began to rise behind me. It used to be our dream, Brielle and I, bringing light to the forgotten corners. Solar grids for mobile homes, for reservation schools, for border clinics running on generators. When she was 12, she used to ride in the back seat with a clipboard, taking notes while I knocked on doors, asking people if they wanted to try something new. Now she sits at the head of the boardroom I designed, making decisions about a company I built. I didn't cry. There's no point in crying when the betrayal comes signed and notarized. Later that night, I opened the envelope. One sheet, plain language. My role had been transitioned to founder emerita, a ceremonial title, no voting rights, no access to internal operations, no legal standing, no voice. If you're still listening, I want you to know something. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with screaming and slammed doors. Sometimes it walks in with a polished suit and smiles like family. And by the time you realize what happened, the locks are changed, and your name is already gone from the sign at the entrance. Have you ever built something with your whole soul, only to be told, politely, that it's no longer yours? Then maybe, just maybe, this story was meant for you. I didn't go home that morning. Not really. I drove aimlessly for hours through the back roads of Arizona, past stretches of land where nothing grew but cacti and stubborn weeds, through forgotten towns where the paint peeled off buildings like old skin. The desert always reminded me of who I was before I became anyone in their eyes. When Brielle was 10, I used to take her on these roads in my beat-up truck. We'd bring sandwiches and blueprints and park outside empty lots, imagining solar panels shimmering under the sun. Back then, she thought I could fix anything. I suppose I did too. But now, that silence in the car wasn't the warm kind. It wasn't the silence of a child napping in the passenger seat. It was the silence of something ending. I stopped at a small gas station outside Superior, bought a bottle of water, and sat on the curb behind the building. The sun was rising higher now, heating the metal of the car until it burned to the touch. I opened the trunk and found the old folder I hadn't looked at in years. Inside were receipts from our first installation jobs, hand-drawn maps, even a letter from a school principal thanking us for restoring power to their classrooms. I held the paper like it was glass. No one remembered these moments anymore. The board only cared about partnerships and headlines. They chased contracts in cities with media coverage. But I remembered every single face from those early days. I remembered which neighborhoods waited 3 months before someone fixed their wiring. I remembered the kids who studied under blinking lights. That night, I didn't sleep in my bed. I pulled the folding chair from the garage and sat beside the dusty boxes where we stored our first-generation batteries. I pulled one open and found the original sketches I made when I couldn't afford a CAD program, just pencil and grid paper. My handwriting was shaky even then. I didn't go to college for engineering. I figured things out the long way. Sometimes that's what makes something real. I laid those papers across the concrete floor, spread them out like old maps of a country that no longer existed. The garage smelled like rubber and heat and memory. And there I sat, cross-legged like a girl, tracing lines I'd drawn with hope in my hand. The company was never just about solar panels. It was about reaching the edges, the places no one else wanted to power. I built it shut because I knew what it felt like to be overlooked. And I built it with Brielle because I believed in passing down more than money. I wanted her to inherit purpose, but maybe I'd handed her something too heavy, or maybe she just never wanted it at all. By morning, I was still on that cold garage floor. The sun cut through the dusty window slats, lighting up one of the old photographs I'd kept taped to the wall. Me and Brielle, standing on top of our first trailer install, arms raised, laughing. That version of us looked like strangers now. I stood up, dusted off my knees, and folded the sketches back into the box. Something had ended, but something else, quiet and steady, was beginning to stir. The morning sun was already unforgiving when I finally opened the envelope. I sat at the old oak table in my kitchen, a place once warm with coffee and laughter, now heavy with something I couldn't yet name. The paper inside was thick, official, printed with the company's seal. The words were clean, formal, and sharp. Effective immediately, I had been reassigned to a non-voting, honorary advisory role. No control, no voice, just a title for ceremony. It wasn't just that I'd been pushed aside, it was how quietly they had done it. The signatures were already there. Brielle's among them. I traced her name with my finger, recognizing the confidence in her handwriting, the loops and sharp ends. That was the same signature she practiced at 13, writing over and over on the backs of napkins at the shop while I filled out invoices. I scanned the packet again and noticed something I hadn't caught the first time. A clause, subtle, buried halfway through, mentioning an update to the company charter. It had been amended 6 weeks prior. All internal votes regarding structural shifts could now proceed without full board consensus, provided a supermajority was present. That was how they did it. They'd rewritten the rules while I was away on a community panel tour in Tucson. I had trusted them to handle the month's administrative routines. Trusted Brielle. I had no idea they were laying groundwork for this. There was no screaming, no confrontation, just the cold mechanics of legality. I pulled out my laptop and began digging. Logged into the board archives with my legacy credentials. They hadn't revoked them yet. The meeting logs were vague. Brielle had chaired 3 sessions, each lasting under 20 minutes. The final one sealed the amendment. I opened my emails from that week. There were none from her. Just one automated message from the operations team about a marketing video in progress. That was it. I closed the laptop and sat back. The betrayal wasn't sudden. It had been quiet, steady, disguised as strategy. I got up and moved to the hallway closet. At the very back, behind old coats and a box of unused phone chargers, I pulled out a black binder. It was thick, worn around the edges. Inside were the original governance drafts I wrote with our first legal advisor, a friend from the community college who had helped us register the company. I flipped through the pages until I found the passage I remembered. A clause I had fought to keep back then, despite pressure to remove it for simplicity. Founders may retain discretionary access to internal documents for purposes of legacy continuity. It wasn't much, but it was something. A thread. I copied the relevant pages and highlighted the clause, slipped them into a fresh folder and labeled it quietly. Then I made tea, sat in the silence and let the weight of it settle. This wasn't just about being pushed aside. This was about being erased, about seeing your name become a symbol instead of a person. They'd used the very foundation I'd built to lock me out, but what they hadn't counted on was that I still remembered every inch of that foundation, every nail, every line of code, every bypass circuit designed for low-income zones. They thought they had moved on without me. But some things, some people, don't vanish just because a line item says so. And if they believed I would quietly fade into the background, they hadn't learned a thing from watching me build. I pulled off the highway just past noon, the sun high over the Arizona hills. Dust curled in spirals behind my car as I turned down a narrow gravel road. I hadn't been here in almost 2 years. The solar station outside Maricopa had once been the pride of our outreach projects, supplying clean energy to over 100 homes, many of them elderly or living on fixed incomes. The gate creaked as I opened it myself. No one came out. The usual hum of the panels syncing with the grid was absent. I stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle into my bones. Something felt wrong. Inside the small utility trailer, a light flickered above the main desk. I pushed open the logbook. The last entry was nearly 3 months ago. I flipped through the pages. There had been no system checks, no technician sign-ins, no supply deliveries since spring. It was now mid-July. I stepped back outside and walked around the array. Dust covered several panels. A bird's nest was jammed between junctions. Wires exposed. One of the battery converters had an orange warning sticker peeling off from sun damage. I knelt down to inspect the cooling unit and found sand buildup caking the filter, something that should have been cleared every few weeks. That was when I heard the wheels. A woman in a motorized wheelchair was making her way down the gravel, wrapped in a denim jacket despite the heat. She was old, older than me, and I recognized her. She used to come to the station once a month to get her blood pressure checked and ask if we'd install lights in the community hall. Her name was Myrtle. She parked beside me, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. "It's been out again," she said softly. "The power flicks off every couple of nights. They said it's upgrading, but it's been months. It gets real dark out here." I nodded, keeping my voice steady. I thanked her and told her I'd look into it. But my hands were shaking. Back at the trailer, I logged into the legacy account we used to manage our rural deployments. Password still worked. I clicked through the maintenance logs, filtering for remote sites. Almost all had been marked suspended due to budget. The reason listed: low media ROI, low visibility, no brand amplification. They had stopped supporting these neighborhoods because no one was watching. I printed the list, then highlighted the 7 sites I had personally fought to include. All were in low-income or tribal regions. All had dropped off the maintenance schedule. Back home that night, I laid the printed maps across my kitchen table. I circled each forgotten station with a red pen. 7 circles, 7 communities left in the dark. I didn't cry, not anymore. Instead, I walked into the spare room where I kept the old archives. Found a storage bin labelled Founding Notes. Inside were handwritten plans, contact sheets, letters from the first field officers. They had called themselves Light Keepers. For a moment, I sat there with the lid open, just breathing. Then I began building a list. A new one. Not for fundraising, not for quarterly reports. A list of names I hadn't called in years. The ones who used to show up in the middle of dust storms with duct tape and hope. The ones who remembered why we started. I didn't need press coverage. I needed to bring the light back. Quietly. Deliberately. And I knew exactly where I'd start. It was just past 7 when I parked near the cafe on 3rd and Main. The place hadn't changed. Same chipped green paint, same faded Coca-Cola sign rattling in the wind, same dusty potted cactus by the door. I hadn't stepped foot in there since the summer we signed our first contract in Flagstaff. That was 12 years ago. Cecilia was already inside. She sat at a booth near the back straight, hands folded, eyes steady. She looked almost exactly the same, just older. White streaks ran through her black hair now, and her blouse hung looser around her shoulders. But her presence hadn't dimmed. I slid into the booth across from her. We didn't say much at first. The waitress brought us 2 black coffees, no sugar, no cream. We didn't ask for menus. She broke the silence first. "I heard you were out." I nodded. That was the easy part to accept. I told her about the solar stations, the cutbacks, the sites that had gone dark. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. She listened without interruption, arms crossed, head slightly tilted like she used to when analyzing a faulty grid. Then I mentioned Myrtle, the power outages, the red pen circles, and the phrase on the report, low media ROI. That one made Cecilia flinch. "You remember when we carried generators on our backs up that dirt hill to reach the school in El Mirage?" I asked. "You remember how we patched the panels with tin foil because funding got delayed, and you ran the circuit line by flashlight?" She stared at her coffee for a long time. Then she nodded. Once. Slowly. "We both believed in the mission," she said. "We believed in Brielle too." That sentence hung between us like dust in a shaft of sunlight. I pulled a folded map from my purse, spread it out on the table. 7 red circles. "These are the ones I can't forget," I said. She looked down, eyes scanning each one like she was remembering not just places, but faces. The elderly couple who sent us tamales after we got their power back. The teenage boy who studied by flashlight until we fixed the inverter. "I want to start again," I told her. "Not a new company, not a press launch, just us. Quiet work, no logos, no headlines." She didn't answer right away, but her hand moved. She took a pen from her purse and began drawing a line on the map, connecting the circles. "We'll need Ellis." Ellis. Of course. The man who once slept in the truck overnight just to guard the panels during a lightning storm. "We'll need permits. Backdoor access to the old maintenance accounts. I still have contacts." Her voice had changed. It had weight again. Not anger. Purpose. I nodded. We called it Quiet Grid. That night, back at home, I turned on the old desktop in the basement. The screen flickered, then lit up. I opened a new spreadsheet, titled it Quiet Grid. 1 column for site name, 1 for last service date, 1 for local contact. I typed the first name under field lead, Cecilia Lawyer, then mine, Evelyn Markham. I leaned back in the chair. Outside, the streetlight buzzed softly. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped into the warm Arizona night. We had no funding, no staff, no legal leverage, but we had memory, we had maps, and we had each other. And that was enough to start. Cecilia moved faster than I expected. By the time I'd finished organizing the contact lists from our old files, she had already reached out to Ellis. He showed up 2 days later in a faded flannel shirt, dusty boots, and with a toolbox slung over his shoulder like it never left his side. His truck still had the old license plate we gave him after he fixed the Buckeye inverter in record time. I didn't recognize him at first. His hair had gone completely silver, and his walk had slowed. But when he opened the hood of the power junction behind our old South Mesa site and ran his hand across the metal like greeting an old friend, I knew he was still Ellis. He didn't ask why I was no longer at the company. He didn't say much at all. He just said, "Where are we starting?" Then came Lorna. She arrived at our temporary command post, an old prefab trailer outside Gila Bend, wearing a blue scarf and carrying 3 large binders under one arm. I hadn't seen her since she retired. She used to coordinate our logistics. People called her the Grid Whisperer. There was a year when floods cut off half the access roads to Navajo County, and Lorna rerouted 10 supply trucks by memory, all while holding a transistor radio to her ear and sipping a root beer float. Now she had crow's feet, thinner wrists, and a softer voice. But her notes were impeccable. She handed them over like blueprints to a forgotten ship. Then Warren rolled in. Literally. 18 wheels, Arizona dust still clinging to the side mirrors. He stepped down from his rig with a thermos in one hand and the same crooked grin that used to drive our interns crazy. "You still drinking that gas station coffee, Evelyn?" he asked, without needing an answer. Within a week, we had rebuilt a skeletal version of the team. No company cards, no branded shirts, just folks who remembered why we started this in the first place. We set up folding tables, ran extension cords from Ellis's generator, and began sketching the map. 7 sites, 4 counties, 43 homes without consistent electricity, no fundraising campaigns, no social media blitz, just word of mouth and old trust. Cecilia called it invisible repair. Warren preferred neighbor work. Lorna said it felt like 2009 again, when we were too poor to fail and too stubborn to stop. Every evening, we'd report back on paper. Paper. None of us trusted digital anymore. The algorithm didn't care about elders using hot plates on shared extension cords or classrooms relying on solar for ceiling fans. By Friday, we had our first success. One small inverter at the outskirts of Duncan. The school janitor had covered it with a tarp for 3 months, hoping someone would show up. Warren and Ellis fixed it before the sun hit noon. The principal sent us a picture that night. Children reading under working lights, dust dancing in yellow beams. We pinned that photo next to the map, with a note beneath. Restored. No headlines, no interviews, just quiet victory. The lights we brought back weren't just electricity, they were memory. In that old trailer with its buzzing lights and rusted corners, it felt like something sacred was coming alive again. And we hadn't even started the hard part. I hadn't walked into a lawyer's office in over a decade, but that morning, I did. My boots were still dusty from the fieldwork, my hands smelled like copper wiring, and I carried a folder that weighed more than it looked. Inside it were blueprints, contracts, letters of intent, and my own will, updated and notarized. I didn't want revenge. I wanted permanence. The lawyer I hired was young, maybe 35, sharp and quiet. She didn't ask for a backstory. I liked her for that. I handed her the file and told her the exact words I needed in the charter. A community trust, a renewable energy grant system, oversight built from retired engineers, school teachers, and elders. Non-profit, irrevocable, and fully funded. I transferred 17% of my shares in the original company into that trust. I didn't sell them. I didn't liquidate a thing. I simply reassigned their influence. Enough to fund Quiet Grid for the next 10 years if run right. Enough to make sure the money went where the sunlight still reached children's desks and old folks' homes. Back at the trailer, Cecilia had already launched a private reporting system. Nothing fancy, just a secure form that let any technician, janitor, or resident log outages and strange patterns. The beauty was in its simplicity. No login, no ID, just stories and names if they wanted to be brave. The reports started to pour in like wind through the cracks, notes from border towns, screenshots of technicians told to skip rural visits, audio files from interns who were laid off after questioning the new inspection routes. Ellis helped us code and tag the data. Lorna double-checked geographic inconsistencies. Warren rerouted deliveries with uncanny instinct, as if he could still read asphalt like a map. The more we collected, the more the shape of something ugly began to appear. It wasn't just negligence, it was design. The company Brielle now controlled was quietly pulling resources from non-profitable zones. Not dangerous zones, not broken ones, just places that didn't serve their narrative. Poor towns with no Instagram presence. Elder communities too tired to protest. Schools that didn't win grants or hashtags. And then we found the document. Cecilia opened it like someone uncovering a body. It was a budget memo, buried inside an archived staff training portal. A line item read, "Redirect low ROI maintenance teams to urban grid showcase sites." They'd made it official, not even hidden, just buried under the assumption no one would care enough to look. I didn't cry. Not this time. I scanned the memo, signed my name on the back, and mailed it, anonymously, to 3 board members I used to trust. That night, we held our first Quiet Grid roundtable. No microphones, no cameras, just 7 of us under a single bulb, sipping tea and listening to wind slide through the trailer seams. We agreed on one rule: no fanfare. If we fixed a site, it stayed between us and the people it served. If we exposed something, it went through legal channels or private letters, not social media, not news. This wasn't about reclaiming image, it was about reclaiming intent. And slowly we saw the impact. A flicker in a grandmother's porch light, a thermostat finally humming in a desert preschool. One by one, these small things reminded us what we'd been building all along. Not a company, not a brand, a promise. And for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. No alerts, no calls, just the knowledge that we were starting to matter again, even if no one noticed. Especially because no one noticed. It started with a knock at my door just after dusk. A courier. No words, just a clipboard, a brown envelope, and a nod. Inside the envelope was a cease and desist letter. I sat at the kitchen table with my hands flat against the wood, while the kettle whistled in the background. The letter claimed I had accessed company systems without authorization, that my recent activity bordered on intellectual property theft. They even bolded certain phrases for emphasis, as if shouting in ink made the lies more credible. It was Brielle, of course. Her signature was at the bottom, neat and assertive, followed by the company's new legal counsel. She was getting nervous, that much was clear. But she didn't know where the leaks were coming from, and that gave us time. Cecilia came by later that night. Her face looked tighter than usual, eyes sharper. She laid her phone on the table and played a recording she'd received anonymously. It was a scratchy voicemail, someone inside the company speaking in hushed tones. They'd overheard a conversation between Brielle and her PR team. Plans to discredit me. Rumors, mostly. That I was no longer mentally sound. That I'd signed important documents under medical distress years ago. They were preparing to spin a narrative before I even made a move. The room felt smaller after that. We sat there, both quiet, like two women realizing that ghosts weren't just in the past. They lived in boardrooms too. Ellis joined us the next morning with a folder under his arm. Printed screenshots, internal chat logs he'd scraped from a test server, mentions of quiet grid, nothing direct, but coded enough to chill the spine. Someone on their side had started piecing things together. There were talks of audits, security reviews, tighter NDAs. They didn't have our names, not yet, but they knew something was happening in the dark. And still, we pressed forward. Cecilia redoubled her efforts. The data stream was flowing in stronger now, especially from younger employees who had quietly found our network. One message came from a technician stationed in the outskirts of Winslow. His report said a family had been without power for 9 days, despite repeated service tickets. The logs had been wiped clean. Lorna drove out the next morning and sent back photos. A mobile home surrounded by dust. An elderly couple with melted candles on every windowsill. A child doing math homework by the glow of a phone screen. The image clung to me all night. It said more than any policy memo ever could. That week, we pushed through 3 more reconnections. No press, just results. Power returned, lights on. Relief, quiet and strong. Then the tone shifted. A retired technician we trusted, Vincent, called Cecilia in a panic. He'd received an internal bulletin that raised red flags. Brielle's office was compiling a document labeled EL Mental Fitness Dossier. My initials, a file with psychological claims. There were references to an old hospital visit I'd made after Richard passed. I'd checked in for exhaustion. Nothing more. But to them, it was a seed. Enough to plant doubt, to build a story around. Cecilia's hands shook when she told me. Mine didn't. I felt something colder than fear. Not rage, not panic. Just a deep, quiet understanding that this was the price of silence. They would try to erase not just my work, but my name, my mind. We made a decision that night. Quiet Grid would stay quiet. But I wouldn't. I drafted a formal notice to the company's legal counsel. Attached was a certificate from my doctor, signed last month, verified. I included a notarized statement from my financial advisor. My taxes, my will, my testimony. I wasn't going anywhere, and I would not let them decide how I faded. The morning after the medical smear attempt, I didn't feel anger. I felt purpose. I brewed my coffee in silence, opened the window to let in the desert air, and pulled out my old ledger from the cedar chest beneath my bed. The pages held names, handshakes, stories. These were the early investors, the ones who had believed in solar before it was fashionable, before Brielle even learned to walk. I drafted 12 letters, handwritten, each addressed to a shareholder who had been there at the beginning. No legal jargon, no pleading, just memory and truth. I wrote about the first installation on the roof of a community centre in Yuma, how we had to climb up twice during a sandstorm to bolt the panels tighter. I wrote about a church that sent us tamales every Friday because we helped lower their monthly bill by 62%. I wrote about what the company used to mean. Attached to each letter was a photo, a grainy but heartfelt image of the older woman in the wheelchair I had met weeks ago, the one whose home finally had stable power again. The picture showed her reaching up to a light switch, eyes filled with something close to wonder. Alongside that was a short report compiled by Cecilia, documenting 86 households that had their power restored in the past 4 weeks through the Quiet Grid initiative. I didn't blame Brielle. I didn't use her name. I spoke only of direction, of legacy, of what happens when a company forgets who it serves. I included a formal request to establish an independent oversight committee focused solely on the company's social and environmental commitments. No executive authority, just eyes and memory, guardians of the original vision. The truth is, I still held 54%. They had forgotten that detail. Brielle's inner circle had grown arrogant, too focused on ousting me to consider what remained intact. I had majority ownership. I just needed 21% more to lock the vote. By midweek, responses started coming in. Some were phone calls. Some were silent confirmations in the form of certified mail receipts. One arrived with a note that simply read, "It's time." Cecilia and Ellis tracked shifts in internal sentiment using anonymous surveys. Several department heads were quietly aligning themselves with the original vision. They'd grown tired of the inflated marketing budgets. The rooftop installations sold more for aesthetics than utility. The boardroom metrics divorced from the grid's real pulse. One letter came back unsigned. A man named Harris. He had once helped me solder faulty connectors in a dusty lot outside Sedona. Now he served on the financial advisory board and remained, as always, cautious. He asked for one thing: proof that our efforts weren't a vanity project. He wanted to see continuity, a plan. I sent him a package the next day. Inside was a 12-page outline of the Quiet Grid's next phase: expansion into tribal lands, partnerships with community colleges, open-source software to let customers monitor energy usage directly. Cecilia added a statement of projected savings based on pilot data. And Lorna? She handwrote a note about the family in Winslow, thanking Harris for the spark. That was the final piece. The board vote was scheduled in less than 2 weeks. Brielle didn't know yet, but the tide had shifted. Not through confrontation, through quiet alignment, through stories retold. The truth was never meant to shout. It simply waited, steady and undeniable, like the sun behind the clouds, like light waiting for a switch. It began with a whisper. The day after I mailed the final packet to Harris, I noticed subtle changes. Colleagues I hadn't heard from in months suddenly went silent again. A young engineer who'd promised to follow up with Cecilia about a test site in Safford sent a cryptic email saying he'd been advised not to be involved further. Something was shifting behind the scenes. Cecilia arrived at my door that evening with a manila folder. Inside was a memo leaked from the public relations team. It was marked draft, but the intent was clear. Brielle had authorized a media package labeling me as increasingly unstable. The narrative framed me as emotionally compromised, hinting that I had been struggling with memory lapses and had, in the past, signed off on critical decisions while under duress from unresolved health issues. It was subtle, but poisonous. The language was carefully measured, as if it came from concern. But the goal was to erode my credibility just days before the board vote. The plan wasn't to remove me legally. It was to create enough doubt that I'd appear unreliable in the eyes of shareholders and the public. Brielle knew she couldn't fight the numbers anymore, so she turned to shadows. Cecilia sat quietly while I read through the memo. Her face was calm, but her hands kept fidgeting with the edge of the tablecloth. I looked up and said only one thing. We need the truth on paper. Verifiable. Irrefutable. The next morning, we reached out to a network of professionals I had kept contact with over the years. Not allies, not loyalists, just people who valued truth. A team of independent doctors conducted a full psychological and cognitive evaluation. Every test, every screen. Cecilia coordinated with our legal counsel, ensuring every step was documented under federal and state standards. Within 48 hours, I had in hand a certified report: no impairments, no concerns, full cognitive function, emotional clarity, physical health appropriate for my age. I didn't share the report yet. I waited. because then came the second blow. Another anonymous source within the company delivered an email chain to Cecilia. It showed that Brielle had quietly approved an internal budget realignment 5 months ago. She redirected over $300,000 from the outreach fund into something labeled Executive Visibility Enhancement, which, as it turned out, included spa retreats, branding consultants, and a 6-month lease on a luxury apartment near Phoenix. Cecilia gathered the evidence, and we prepared a dual packet. On one side, my medical clearance, on the other, the financial misuse, each one damning on its own. Together, they told a story. No accusations, just facts. I sent copies to the Oversight Committee in formation, the original 12 shareholders, and legal representation for the board. The timing was intentional, just 3 days before the official vote. Brielle's team scrambled. They released a public statement that same night claiming misunderstandings around executive spending and concern for my well-being. But the words rang hollow now. Too many eyes had seen too much. Cecilia and I didn't respond publicly. We didn't need to. Instead, we returned to work. We checked the quiet grid nodes. We updated the energy reports. And I called Lorna to confirm the final site in Bisbee had gone live. When you plant seeds in truth, you don't rush the harvest. You wait. You water. And when the time is right, you gather quietly. The storm was almost here, but I had already found shelter, not in walls, but in what we had built, and no storm could take that away. The conference room was smaller than I remembered. The long oak table, polished to perfection, reflected the morning sun in streaks of gold. 12 chairs lined each side, everyone occupied by a familiar face. Old colleagues, founding shareholders, people I had once shared vending machine coffee with at midnight during our first prototype rollout. Brielle sat at the far end, crisp in her tailored blazer, surrounded by her legal team. I didn't bring anyone with me. Not Cecilia, not Harris. I wanted no distractions, no noise, just the truth. The chair of the meeting, Marvin Elliott, cleared his throat. His voice had lost its sharpness, but not its authority. He read the agenda slowly, then, without ceremony, invited me to speak first. I stood. My knees didn't shake, but my breath caught slightly as I looked around the table. I didn't present a slideshow. No graphs, no projections, just a single folder in my hand. I began by reminding them of a woman named Carla Price, an 81-year-old widow in Cochise County, whose ranch had gone off-grid in 2013 using one of our earliest panel kits. I told them about how she used to send handwritten notes every winter, thanking us for keeping her home warm when temperatures dropped below freezing. I passed around a photograph of her front porch light, recently turned back on thanks to Quiet Grid. I spoke of legacy, not in terms of financial reports or market caps, but in lives touched. Schools lit, clinics powered, grandparents with air conditioning in the desert heat. I said nothing about Brielle, not a single accusation, but I placed 2 reports on the table. One from the board-certified evaluation, clearing me of any mental decline. The other, a financial audit detailing expenditures made under Brielle's direction, drawn from funds once designated for outreach. There were no raised voices, no objections. Marvin asked if any party wished to make a statement. Brielle stood. She was composed, rehearsed. She spoke about strategy, public perception, scalability. Her words were precise, but they didn't reach far. Then came the vote. It was not a vote to remove her. I had never asked for that. The motion was simple, to re-establish a community oversight board that would monitor outreach allocations and evaluate executive decisions regarding public trust operations. 12 hands, one by one, some hesitant, some firm, 10 in favour, 1 abstained, 1 opposed. The motion passed. Brielle didn't look at me when it ended. She folded her notes, nodded to her team, and left the room before Marvin adjourned the meeting. No one cheered, no applause, just silence. I walked out alone. The desert air was still, almost too still for mid-morning. I sat in my car a while, letting the warmth soak through the windshield. The road ahead wasn't a return to the past. I wouldn't be reclaiming the title of CEO. That chapter was closed. But what had opened was something quieter, deeper, a stewardship, not a throne. In the rearview mirror, I saw the board members begin to exit the building. Some paused before leaving the lot. A few looked up, perhaps wondering how long the sun had been this harsh. It had always been that way, but today it felt just a little more forgiving. I woke up before sunrise, no alarm, just the quiet hush of the Arizona morning. The sky outside my bedroom window had barely begun to shift from indigo to gold. I pulled on my boots and stepped outside. The air was cool, dry. The scent of creosote and sun-baked dirt filled my lungs. For the first time in months, my hands weren't trembling. There was nothing urgent waiting, no boardroom, no legal notice, just the soft rhythm of a day beginning. A single notification blinked on my phone. One of the field techs had sent it before dawn. The message was simple. System normal. Power levels steady. All nodes online. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The quiet grid was stable. It was working. Another message followed minutes later. From Cecilia. A photo. A child, no older than 10, sitting in a tiny classroom somewhere in Apache County. The lights were on. A fan spun slowly overhead. The boy's face was turned toward the whiteboard, pencil in hand, focused. There had been days when I wondered if all of this would be for nothing. When Brielle's team pushed the mental incompetency narrative, I had felt the old weight of doubt crawl up my spine. But I held on, not because I needed to win, but because I needed to remember why I started. I went back inside and unrolled the map in my den. I traced the old lines with my fingers. Each dot used to represent potential. Now, they meant restoration. I picked up a pen and marked a new one in dark ink. Quiet grid, node 8, fully operational. I sat back in the chair and closed my eyes. Not in exhaustion, just to let the stillness in. I thought about all the people who had quietly returned. Ellis, Lorna, Warren. They had never needed a podium, only purpose. And I had found mine again, not through revenge or reclaiming a title, but by giving the light back. It wasn't just electricity that returned to those forgotten corners of the desert. It was dignity, presence, memory. And somewhere in that, I had come back to myself too. The past would remain where it belonged. Brielle was still in her position, but now watched, accountable. And the legacy of this company, of my life, was no longer just in profit sheets or press releases. It was in the glow of a porch light, the hum of a fan, the learning curve of a child's pencil. I didn't need a celebration. The quiet was enough. And the light, soft and certain, was still there. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt erased, overlooked, or quietly replaced, maybe it's time to ask where your light still shines. I'd love to know what part of Evelyn's journey spoke to you the most. You're not alone. We're listening,